Okay. David, we are live.
Hey, Spencer.
Lovely to see you. Uh,
Good to see you as well.
Interesting times that we live in, but at least we've got some stuff to give thanks to with some beer and some great, great chocolates that you've chosen. So, for those of
Interesting
you,
is a generous adjective, but we'll go with interesting.
yeah. Well, yeah. So, for those of you who don't know, I'm Spencer from Coco Runners, and I'm here today joined by the amazing David Nilsen, who runs one of my favorite podcasts, Bean to Barstool, but is, I think, an extraordinarily rare and fantastic guy to have here to chat to because he is that rarity who's an expert not just in craft chocolate, but also in craft beer. And there's a phenomenal overlap between the two. And the aim of today is to talk a little bit about David's history, but also talk a little bit about the similarities and the opportunities that I think are presented by craft beer for craft chocolate. And also, David is an expert on pairing. So I intend to learn a lot from him about pairing. So, David, over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this amazing position of being an expert, not just on craft chocolate, but also on beer.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Spencer. I'm looking forward to hanging out for a little bit today. As you mentioned, they are interesting times. So, doing events like this is a nice distraction for a little while. We can talk about beer and chocolate, and the world is a happy place for a little while. Yeah, so my background, I started out originally in craft beer, started freelance writing and speaking about beer close to a decade ago. Worked on that pretty much exclusively for a couple years, and then actually got into craft chocolate through beer. I was tasked with leading a beer and chocolate pairing, and very naively assumed that that couldn't possibly be too complicated. Reached out to somebody who knew more about craft chocolate, a local craft chocolate seller, and she quickly dispossessed me of that idea, and I began my craft chocolate education and very quickly fell down the rabbit hole with that, discovered a lot of similarities between these two fields and a lot of ways that they both pulled at the same threads of curiosity for me. And I started following these as parallel paths from there on. In 2020, I started the Bean to Barstool podcast and website to look at the intersections between craft beer and craft chocolate, pairing, use of similar ingredients, collaborations between the two. And then just earlier this year, I published the Pairing Beer and Chocolate book, which is the only published guide to pairing beer and chocolate out there in the world, which, in addition to being available on beantobarstool.com, is also available on Coco Runners. Thank you for that, Spencer. So
No,
yeah,
tell
now
it.
I spend my time writing and speaking and interviewing and all sorts of different things around craft beer and craft chocolate.
But originally, how did you get into craft beer? I mean, what was the connection there? Is there something you have always sort of, is there a family connection? Is there a,
No, yeah, not a family connection. I actually grew up very conservative, religious, which I've since left, but there was no alcohol in my upbringing at all. When I started drinking in my early 20s, craft beer was kind of just what my friends were into. My very first experience with craft beer, my sister and I were on a family vacation with our parents in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which is this beautiful area of the northern U.S. On one of the Great Lakes. And the town that we stopped in before we went to the campground where we were going to stay had a single gas station. And we went into this gas station. We were going to get something that we could drink at the campsite. And we knew nothing about beer at all. But there were a couple of six packs of local craft beer. One of them had a connection to a historical shipwreck in the area. We liked the branding on it. We're like, sure, we'll get that and see what it is. Took it back to the campsite. Ended up loving that beer, and then just very slowly, kind of that snowball roll of curiosity where you learn one thing and you want to learn one more thing, and it just keeps going from there. So over the next 10 years, 12 years, I just kind of progressively got more interested, learned more things. Around 2012 or 2013, I got to the point where I realized that I either needed to really dive in on a systematic understanding of the taxonomy of beer because it is so complicated, the number of styles and national traditions, or stop this sort of incremental accumulation of knowledge because it was not going to get me to a place of really understanding what was going on. So I decided to dive in and kind of self-educate, read some books and talked to some people. And then around 2015, I was starting to get a little anxious around my current employment. I was not enjoying where I was and had a few jobs in a row where I was starting to understand things about myself and why I did and did not enjoy different types of work. And decided that I could give freelance writing a try. I'd always been doing writing for myself, just creative writing and different little projects and things. Um, and that coincided with, really kind of catching the bug on craft beer. And so put some effort over the next year or so into establishing some paths out of my previous job and getting some certifications on the beer side, and then stepped out to start doing that professionally. Was in the fortunate position to have a lot of freedom as a freelancer early on. My wife had a job that more or less was able to take care of us, so I could kind of build that organically from the ground up rather than having to replace a full-time job immediately. And it provided a lot of freedom to be able to do this the way that I wanted to, and then build a sustainable career from that.
That's fantastic. Because the thing which really impresses me in a way is that you were able to self-educate yourself in that way. So, what were the materials, and how did you go about doing that? And maybe compare a little bit what it's like, sort of educating yourself about craft beer, and then educating yourself about craft chocolate. What would you sort of say the differences are?
Yeah, for sure. So early on, I was, just using some books that provided sort of a systematic arranging of styles and national traditions, and went over all the basics of ingredients and brewing process and things like that. And there's so much information there that it becomes really built on repetition of reading the same things repeatedly from different writers saying basically the same things in different ways until each of those finally clicks, and you can kind of build that systematic understanding for yourself. I'm an advanced Cicerone, so the
Yeah,
Cicerone certification program lines up to the Court of Master Sommeliers certification. So you have 4 tiers of that. And when I was studying for the second tier of the Cicerone program, which is the first one that really requires a lot of committed time to it, while they don't provide their own study materials for the most part, they do provide a syllabus that allows you to kind of systematically go through and do your own study and build the understanding that you need. So that was really helpful just from an organizational standpoint. It's something that I think chocolate is still missing a very good organized, systematic education system.
yeah,
And, we still don't really have, we're still trying to come up with a certification system that will catch on and actually get the critical mass to become an industry standard, I would say. I
yeah,
think in some ways, chocolate education is a little easier because we don't have the style taxonomy that we have on the beer side, where you've got 150 different styles, to deal with. At the same time, chocolate can struggle a little bit with what wine education struggles with, where the variations come in much more subtle forms. And being able to understand those subtleties, there's not necessarily a cleanly organized way to be able to explain all that. And it has to come largely from a lot of time and a lot of experience, just being able to pick up nuances of differences between things. And so, in some ways, it's simpler, but I think in some ways, there's kind of a longer runway to actually be able to achieve an understanding.
yeah. I think that specificity point and that certification point are both definitely there. But I mean, now that we're on this, I mean, we should probably dive in a bit because you are my go-to expert on craft beer and all matters craft
Awesome.
beer. So it would be great to hear a little bit from you. I know you cover this in the book, and you cover this a lot in the podcast. But just run us through the history of craft beer in the States, because it's very different over here in the UK. We've had
Hmm.
Camera, we do have a craft beer movement, but it's very much following in the footsteps of the US. So I think, if people in the craft chocolate world, actually, it's quite an interesting one to
Yeah.
hear, and hearing it from the Oracle himself would be awesome.
Sure. Yeah. So looking at the history of brewing in the US, starting 200 years ago, you had a lot of influence from immigrant brewers. Originally, that was English brewers. And then during the mid 19th century, that was uh, German and Bohemian brewers who were kind of fleeing some political turmoil in their homelands. And you got this really robust brewing world in the United States. Throughout the 19th century, you had a variety of styles. Beer was a part of social life. And then you had Prohibition at the beginning of the 20th century, and it kind of wiped out 100+ years of building an industry and building this into the fabric of social life. And when we came out of Prohibition, we were then in the Great Depression, and then we hit World War II. And so we basically had 25 years of either legal or economic steamrolling of artisan beverage. And at the end of that, coming into this era of prosperity in the United States in the mid 20th century, where people were building families, convenience culture was becoming a very big thing on the consumer side of things. You ended up with a lot of homogenization. And so even the breweries that survived Prohibition and survived the Great Depression and survived World War II were just getting slowly choked out and either purchased or put out of business by a handful of very large breweries. So by the time you got to the 1970s, the brewing scene in the United States was pretty dismal. Everything was basically very easy drinking pale lagers, which can be great in the right moment, but not great when it's the only thing that's available. And you
Yeah,
only had a handful of brands, a handful of companies really who were selling those brands. And so beer was one thing, and there was really no other options. You had some underground home brewing that was taking place, but home brewing was not actually legal in the United States until 1979. And you had a couple of breweries that started up in the late 60s and 70s. You could count on one hand these breweries that started trying to do more interesting things, recreate some historical styles with moderate success, but no real sales success to speak of. The legalization of home brewing in 1979 created a talent pipeline that allowed people to learn how to brew and then be able to transition that into small scale professional brewing. So around 1980 and then into the first half of the 80s, you got this wave of small, what we would now call craft breweries opening and recreating historical European styles, primarily British styles, and adapting those to American ingredients and American tastes. And then you got several waves that followed that, the late 80s into the 90s, and it just kind of steadily grew from there. The real explosion in terms of becoming a meaningful economic force in the beer scene commercially really came within the last 10 to 15 years. Around 2012 to 2014 is when we saw a massive explosion in the number of small breweries. And now craft beer, depending on how you want to define that, represents about 15% of the beer market in the United States, which still doesn't sound like a huge amount, but is enough to meaningfully influence what is available. You can find craft beer pretty much anywhere you go now in the US, but everything really changed when home brewing became legal and people could suddenly learn how to brew without having to make this a career at a, you know, corporate industrial brewery in order to be able to learn the ropes. And that's when you started to see more small scale breweries opening.
and what do you think are some of the factors which define craft in this? I mean, you mentioned there's the certification, there's the different styles. But what is it? What
Yeah.
is there a philosophy? Is there what are the key attributes that you think
Well,
marketers are?
Spencer, I wish I could tell you that in the half century since we've had craft beer, we've resolved this argument, but unfortunately, we have not. This is an easy way to either start an argument or just exhaust some people very quickly when you bring it up. But we've argued about this for a long time. One easy way to define this, there is a organization called the Brewers Organization in the United States that is the main trade organization for craft breweries. They define craft beer based upon ownership, how much of your brewery is owned by a larger industrial brewery. They define it by size. You can only produce a certain amount. Those are obviously kind of flexible walls. They put up rigid walls around those, but reasonable people can disagree about what those definitions can be. I think a lot of people would kind of loosely define it philosophically as a focus upon the actual quality of the beer and brewing for flavor and enjoyment rather than just commodity. But again, that's going to have shifting definitions depending on the individual. I use the term craft beer, assuming that most people are broadly going to understand most of the type of beer I'm talking about when I say that. But even among beer writers today, there is kind of a push to get away from the term just because it doesn't mean anything. There's nothing definably that you can say this is definitely craft beer and this is definitely not, especially as the market matures and we get more um, capital investment and buyouts and different things. You got the same people at the same brewery brewing the same beer, but now they're owned by somebody else. Did the beer change? Is it not craft beer anymore? It's very complicated. So,
Right.
broadly, I think most people generally understand what I mean when I say craft beer, but when you get into actually cleanly defining the borders of that, I'm not sure anybody is up to perfectly litigating those definitions.
Yeah, I think we've discussed this separately before. And I think that's quite similar in a way in craft chocolate, in the sense that the
Mhm.
focus is on flavor, the focus is on the quality of the ingredients, and on the style of manufacturing. But actually
Mhm.
trying to, as you say, narrow that down into a definition which is as simple as the one you can do for ownership or size just doesn't
Right.
really work. It's phenomenally
Yeah.
different. And yet it's sort of interesting that, and I think you hinted at some of the reasons. I mean, I'd love to get just a rough idea of what you think the size of the craft beer market is as a percentage of the overall US beer market.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's about 15% in terms of, I'd have to look back. I don't remember if that's production or sales because those numbers would be different since
Yeah,
the cost of craft beer is higher. I believe it's production, I believe, but
yeah, I
don't
think
quote
it
me
is
on that.
because I think it is that because I've seen a slightly higher
Yeah.
number for when it comes to
Yeah,
sales
I
value.
think
I've
it's
seen
like
a
20,
higher number.
around 20. I do want to
Yeah,
say I think it's around 20 for sales and 15 for production. I think culturally, it's got more saturation than that. 15 doesn't sound like a huge number, but if you compare that to something like music, the vast percentage of music is pop music that can be sent to the largest number of people, but there's a massive influence from that smaller, relatively smaller percentage of artists that
yeah,
are trying to innovate. So I think culturally, the influence of craft beer is pretty pervasive here now. You still have plenty of people who either don't drink it or don't care. But you can go into pretty casual restaurants and get craft beer options. And almost every town has a craft brewery or a bar that is serving good options. And I would say that the influence is bigger than that number represents, but the number itself is still relatively small.
yeah. I think that is those are really from us in the craft chocolate world. Those are really sort of fascinating and in some ways encouraging, but slightly sort of puzzling numbers because I don't
Mhm.
know what the number is you would put for craft chocolate sales. But
Smaller.
yeah, I mean,
Smaller
I
than
think
that.
if it's even a percentage, I think it would be doing pretty well.
Yeah,
Um,
I would, yeah, that is definitely low single digits, I would say,
yeah, I
without
think it's
having the
probably
numbers in front of me. Yeah,
yeah, I think it's probably the lower. Even, I don't even think it gets to a single digit.
I,
Whereas
I would agree. Yeah.
craft beer, and specialty coffee are up there in the you know high teens, low twenties. And I
Yeah.
guess one of the interesting questions is why do you think that is? I mean, you've hinted at one thing, and I think it would be great to go more into it because you are an advanced. I always pronounce this word wrong, Ciceronian, um,
Cicerone. Yeah.
Cicerone, which I'd love to know the origin of that term and a little bit more about that because I do think that
Yeah.
education. I mean, the wine industry's done it. The second biggest expenditure of tourist dollars, both local and international, in California is people basically going to wineries to learn about wine.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah,
there is a huge wine education movement too, and there's definitely that inside beer. But tell us a bit about Cicerone.
yeah. So the Cicerone program was started in I believe 2007 by a beer expert, just kind of guy around the industry who was well respected, named Ray Daniels, and he had found the term. It's an Italian word that means guide, and I believe, though I don't have the proof, I believe this is probably derived from Cicero, who would have
Yeah,
been
that's
guiding Dante through the Inferno, right? So I think that's probably the etymology, although that is not something the Cicerone program has said. I'd have to do some digging to prove that, but that's an awful coincidence if it's not the truth.
yeah,
So the education component's an interesting one, and I think that this is something that beer and craft chocolate share. You have an opaqueness to the process and the ingredients for both beer and chocolate that doesn't exist for wine and coffee. People understand that wine and coffee are agricultural products. Even if they don't understand anything about the process itself, they couldn't tell you how these are grown. They know that wine is grapes. They know that coffee is coffee beans. And they know that those industries have done a great job of telling that story and selling at least especially on the wine side, selling that tourism component. You can come here and have this sort of idyllic agrarian experience and see our vineyard and taste our wine and come right to the destination and do that. That is impossible on the beer side because the ingredients come from different places and have to be transformed before you can make beer. And you've got this synthesis of different ingredients coming together. So even though it's an agricultural product, there's this opaqueness around that process where people don't know what those ingredients are or how they come together or what they do in the process. And I think chocolate is the same way. For a long time, people have assumed chocolate is just this thing that shows up on store shelves and they don't recognize the agricultural component. They don't know what that ingredient is. They don't have any connection to that process. And so with wine and coffee, people can have that in mind and they can understand that component. And beer and chocolate, there is this extra step of study and curiosity that has to take place, this education component, before you can even get to that same baseline that people are starting at with wine and coffee. Even if they don't understand anything about the process, they understand those basics. They don't understand those basics on beer and chocolate. And so there's this barrier that has to be passed to even get people to the starting line of where do you learn more about these ingredients? Where do you care more about these processes? So I think that's a big barrier that both beer and chocolate face, and it's a major component of why there is a both more difficulty, I think, in taking these two products seriously as artisan products, but also a barrier of getting people to invest deeper in understanding them.
yeah. That's very insightful. I think that's very interesting. But I think you're definitely right. And I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. Although, as a further question to you, in a way, coffee, though, is quite similar to chocolate in the sense that, it's grown in a different place to where it's crafted. And
Yeah, but
yet,
people hold the beans in their hand. If they're making coffee at
right,
home, even if it's in a transformed, a different
right,
form, they are seeing grounds or seeing beans. They know it came from this thing. They might not care anything beyond that,
yeah,
but they know this bean came from somewhere, period. That's the starting point.
yeah, that's
And
very
I think
interesting, actually.
chocolate or coffee has done even even though it does not have the saturation that the craft coffee movement would love, they have done a good job of selling the idea of origin, even if it's a
Yeah,
trick and people don't actually care the difference between a Tanzanian coffee and a Guatemalan coffee. They're seeing those terms when they walk into even a Starbucks before you even get into maybe what we would consider better roasted craft coffee, they're going into a coffee shop that is on the street corner of every major city in the world practically, and they are seeing place names. They are seeing Sumatra. They are seeing Costa
yeah,
Rica. They're seeing these names They might not care anything beyond that, but it is doing a good job of just at least helping people at that starting line know that this is something that was grown somewhere.
Yeah, and I think that is a very good point. I think one other thing I would sort of say is hats off to America in wineries, because I think that the American wine education, I mean, we sort of knock it a lot, but actually, you try getting into a vineyard in Europe and it's a problem.
Hmm.
And it's interesting that the UK is now trying to sort of grow wine, and there's some great wineries, but they haven't learned from this American experience as the building the community and building the education. So I think that's definitely it. I mean, and I think also wine's got things like the WSET. It's got great programs for, and I think coffee's got that too. So I think that it's interesting that you can get that with coffee in a really interesting way. I mean, you can really educate into coffee in a different way, I think,
Yeah.
than we've sort of than we have yet there. So I think that that's definitely one angle to it as well. Um, um, and yeah, I think that's definitely one of the big angles to it. I mean, I guess the other one, there are a few others which we could sort of debate a bit about, which is, I mean, I guess one of the interesting questions we always ask makers is, what time of day do you think people eat your craft chocolate? And most of them, after scratching their heads a bit, will sort of say, well, in the evening, which is very different to what it is with mass market confectionery. And I guess that
Hmm.
one of my, so it's a different habit, if you like. So,
Hmm.
so craft chocolate is not a straight substitute. Do you think that
Hmm.
people have craft beer instead of mass produced fizz, for want of a better word? Do you think they are in the same occasion, the same habit?
Sure. I think this has been an interesting shift in the beer world, and it's the new challenge that craft beer is going to have to face. So I think for a while, I think there was a difference. I think craft beer was selling itself so hard on flavor and the uniqueness of the flavors of these beers. And um, oh, this particular beer, we used this ingredient. You got it. It's crazy. Nobody else is doing this. Try it and see what you think. And so I think there was at least, whether or not it was actually happening on a large scale or not, the image around craft beer was that this was something that you were tasting. This was something that you were having and you were celebrating
Yeah,
the product itself. And I think on some scale that was true. We were having things like beer festivals, bottle shares where people getting together and bringing rare beers and everybody's getting samples of those and talking about them. Those have both lost popularity of late, and we've seen just in the last couple years, craft beer is really struggling here in the U.S. We're losing sales. Some breweries are closing, and I think what's happened is that in some ways, craft beer has been a victim of its own success, where it set out initially to displace mass-produced beer, but it went about it with this bit of a bait and switch where it was trying to sell a different experience. It was trying to say this is about taste and flavor. It's not just replacing the mass produced beers that you were having with your friends before. Now we've come around to where it has been successful enough that it has actually displaced mass produced beer, at least for a certain percentage of the market. The problem with that is that the bloom is off the rose a little bit on this just being a thing that you can pursue for itself, for flavor itself, and it has replaced just the same drinking occasions. If that's the case, people have to pay more for the exact same experience they were having with mass produced beer. If the focus isn't on the tasting experience, if this is really pay for an IPA while you're just hanging out with your friends instead of paying for a 4% lager, then now you're losing some sales back when people are like, well, actually, I just kind of want a simple beer if I'm just hanging out with my friends. And I think that's been like an interesting shift that we're seeing right now. And now the next wave of work is going to be much slower as craft beer tries to sell the value of this more expensive, more premium product for the exact same occasion that you could be drinking Bud Light or whatever other mass produced beer is available. On the chocolate side, I'd be interested to see, and I don't know that any kind of organized study has been done on this, but I'd be interested to see if that's actually true about those differences in occasions, because I think a lot of people, at least in my experience, who are still drinking what or still uh, tasting what we would call, cheaper chocolate and non-craft chocolate, chocolate that isn't sourced traceably, et cetera, whatever uh, guardrails we want to put around that, I think they're still treating that as a treat. I think they are treating themselves to having, even if it's something that we wouldn't consider special, Dove or Lindt or Godiva or whatever,
No, no.
they're still pulling that out and treating themselves to that. They're still giving it on anniversaries. They're still using it as a sign of specialness. And I'd be curious to see if that, because I think that's actually one of the barriers, is that we aren't necessarily introducing people to a whole new way of enjoying chocolate. They've been enjoying chocolate as a treat for themselves since they were children. We're having to convince them that you should pay 5 times as much because this is X, Y, Z, whatever reasons we're giving there. It's better, it's more ethical, it's whatever. And I think that's a significant challenge because if our argument is just the chocolate you're enjoying isn't good chocolate, that's a losing argument. It's really,
Yeah.
really hard to convince people they don't like something they know they like. They've
I
been
mean, I
treating
think,
themselves.
yeah, I
Go
think
ahead.
you're absolutely right. I mean, I think one of the other differences is that, what's in inverted commas, the addictive stuff in beer is, in either case, whether it's craft or it's mainstream, it's alcohol. The difference is with chocolates, with craft chocolate, sugar is used as a flavor enhancer, whereas in mass produced chocolate, that is the delight,
Yeah,
if you like. That is the addictive object. I mean, it's also
sure.
used because it's cheap and it's a good bulking agent and it's a good stabilizer, it's a good preservative. But I do think that that's a big difference. Is that they are the addictive thing in caffeine, whether it's specialty coffee or whether it's mainstream coffee, is still caffeine. So I think I think you're right. I mean, I think with chocolate, so when you talk to mass-produced chocolates, I mean, one the sort of the comparison is a bit unfair because most chocolate is actually not consumed in the form of chocolate bars. Most chocolate is consumed as
Sure. Yeah.
cakes or as ice creams or as other ingredients. So I think in a way, chocolate sort of, and in fact, probably arguably the most successful of all the craft chocolate companies, although I don't think anyone would see them as being craft chocolate anymore, is Valrhona, who went
Mm,
for the cooking market. And I think some of the craft chocolate makers are now realizing that ingredients market is interesting. But I think coming back to your point about how do people have mass produced chocolates, I think that they have it as either a treat or as a pick me up.
mm,
And the history to the chocolate bar is a strange one. I mean, the bar emerged because it was very convenient to put it in vending machines. And that's how chocolate was sold in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. And it was consumed at breakfast. It was consumed as a lunch because you could very portable. And it was a treat. And then it sort of became a treat too. But I think it's a pick me up and a treat. But you are right that just trying to sell it as because it's better without explaining that is tricky. And I'd like to go back to this point that you made though about people focused on the flavor of craft beer because to me that is the fascinating thing. I
mhm.
mean the fascinating thing about all craft, whether they be beer, chocolate, cheese, wine, is that what really differentiates them is flavor as
Mm,
opposed to taste. So I'm using the terms very deliberately. Most foods are around sugar, salt, fat, the bliss point, and a bit of
right.
sensory specific satiety, but those are very much up and down. Whereas flavor is much more complex. And it is
Yeah.
strange that in the craft chocolate world, it's true of most foods that the science of flavor is remarkably poorly understood and researched and
Mhm.
taught. And I think in a way, beer actually did a much better job. But even there, I'm not sure that they completely, cracked
Well,
it all.
I think one of the, I mean, flavor still drives me, of course, and it still
Yeah,
drives you. And I think probably the people watching this would say that as well. And I think it's hard to forget how unbelievably small a percentage of the market we are because we're invested in this. And it's really hard to accept that people who like the same products, who are drinking craft beer or eating craft chocolate, at least occasionally, are never going to be that invested. And that's okay, but it's a different sales proposition to them to get them into this because they're not going to be solely devoted to the idea of flavor in those
yeah,
occasions. And that's okay. That's going to be most people. So we're going to have to figure out how to sell to them. And I think one of the difficult things, especially on the chocolate side, because the stakes are so much higher, because we're talking about human rights issues and are farmers and laborers being paid adequately, or are they being taken horrible advantage of? Is there child slavery? We've got these higher human stakes on that side. It is very difficult to accept as an educator, as a seller, that that's going to be incremental. There are going to be people that you're going to convince to occasionally get a craft chocolate bar, but they're also going to continue to get Dove or whatever else. And like that incrementalism, while it is not probably a successful political strategy, it can be a successful business one. And accepting that there might be some limited buy-in, but that's going to be a stratified buy-in of people who are doing it all the time versus people who are occasionally now slotting in a craft bar in place of Lindt or whatever else.
Yeah, I think that I think you've made a bunch of really interesting observations there. And I'd like to throw in a couple more, which is it's interesting. You and I are talking as a Brit, as an American. One of the things which has really fascinated me is the way that craft chocolate has just mushroomed and ballooned in a couple of European countries. And in
Mm,
particular, now it's starting to take off in Asia. And I'd like to sort of just step back a bit and just talk about the different food cultures because it's not accidental that both in the US and the UK, we have the highest proportions of ultra processed food, and I'm using it as a buzzword, but
sure.
we are basically, most of us in the UK, less than, according to the Food Standards Agency, less than 30% of UK households have got a table to eat at, which
Mm,
is fairly staggering.
wow.
And what
Yeah.
we eat, 60, 70% of the calories we consume is ultra processed. And that means that it doesn't have flavor. It doesn't have length. It doesn't have intensity. It doesn't have balance. It doesn't have what we sort of talk about with the flavor wave that you and I have sort
Mhm.
of, pushed on in other ways. But I think if you go to somewhere like Spain and you just look at how the craft chocolate world has just exploded, I mean, it's extraordinary how successful it's
Mhm.
becoming. And France has now got, it's not just Stefan Bonnat who's sort of, leading the way. It's not just, you know, Frank Morin. There are now lots of people. There's Incentro, there's Hasner, there's Plaque. And I think the thing that they've got is that they have a language. The French, because they're used to, saying when they basically eat at home with their mother and father or with their friends, they're used to being able to describe the food and they can articulate it. And I think
Mhm.
that one of the things that I sort of find interesting about craft beer, and I definitely get it with craft chocolate, is that it is this difference between taste and flavor. So, when you have an industrial chocolate bar, let me use that because it's the easy one. It's sugar, it's salt, it's fat, and there's a bit of texture, but it's a quick up and down. It's not a journey. And everybody can appreciate the basic tastes. Learning to identify sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami, fat. We can all do that. You've got to do a little bit of work on it, but it's like, if you give somebody a pair of running shoes, you tell them to run every day. For a week, they're going to probably want to kill you, but after a month, they're going to get into it and appreciate it. Whereas I think flavor actually is not as instinctive. I think that flavor for at least, many of the people I know, and then they come to the craft chocolate shows that we do, it's much more like swimming, which is to say that if I drop somebody in a pool or in a pond every day for a month, after a week, they're going to want to kill me. After a month, they really are going to kill me because you've got to be shown how to do it. And I think that one of the advantages that some of the Europeans and some of the Asians, like Thailand, is extraordinary what's happening with craft chocolate, is they just get flavor and they suddenly realize that chocolate has got this extraordinary complexity of flavor. And I think what's interesting about craft beer is going back to what you were saying is that you're right. There may have been, recently you've almost sort of been a victim of your own success, but you did get people to appreciate flavor
Mhm.
because that's what the difference is. If you drink industrially processed pop, whether it is just a spike. All you're going to get is the taste and the texture. You're not going to get the flavor wave. Whereas if you get a great craft beer, I think you do get that flavor wave. So I
Yeah.
guess, love to get your thoughts on that, but I'd also love to know a little bit more about how you think and how you educate people about flavor.
Yeah. I mean, I think you mentioned, first of all, I think that's insightful about the differences in those food cultures. I don't think I thought about it in those terms, but um, I think you alluded to the idea that flavor is poorly understood, and flavor science is poorly understood. I think in some cases we're a victim of our own evolution. The efficiencies that our brains have built in to make our survival easier, if survival were still something we had to be doing in the
Mm.
wild, have hamstrung us a bit on being able to slow down and appreciate flavor because our brain has simplified that entire process to make us believe it is one single sense instead of we have to do the work to separate those back out and recognize the difference between aroma, taste, and the synthesis of flavor between those. And then building in, the influence of appearance and the influence of mouthfeel and even the influence of sound and different things like that. Our brain doesn't want to do that. Our brain wants us to give us the simplest piece of information possible about this is edible or this is not, this is nutritious or this is not, even if it's not very good at doing that now because we hacked the system industrially. But to slow down and actually appreciate flavor requires reverse engineering our own evolutionary progress on the sensory side, and that is a difficult thing to do. It's like, I mean, you just gave the illustration of running or swimming. I mean, it is painful exercise. You have to go against what your body initially wants you to do, and
Yeah,
that
that's a very good
requires the
point.
attention.
But it's rewarding. I mean, it's like
It is.
most things. It's like, I mean, it is the sort of, I sort of give there's a sort of analogy, which is that it's like sort of playing a video game, which is just constantly just trying to get you to get to the next level and play more of it, which
Yeah.
is when you play a great board game, you're sad when it's over, but it was a great
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is rewarding, but all areas of popular culture have taught us that what is ultimately more rewarding is not necessarily what's going to be more successful because it's harder. This is the reason
Yeah.
that superhero movies are dominating the movie industry now, and everything is franchise, because it's easy to go and sit down and just be entertained for 2.5 hours rather than having to think about story and learn these new complex characters and all that. Even if that's going to ultimately be more rewarding, life is hard. Life is hard for a lot of people. People either don't necessarily want to put in that work, or maybe they have not been taught to put in that work. Maybe they have not been, maybe their curiosity was never unlocked with the situations they were in with childhood or young adulthood. And so it's easier to just take the equivalent of sugar in whatever these different situations are because it's an immediate quick reward.
Yeah.
So even though this other stuff is absolutely more rewarding, it's not obviously more rewarding. It's not quickly more rewarding. It is something that requires work and investment. And that's something that a lot of people are going to need handheld along the way to get to.
Yes. And I think also you need to appeal to other motives to get people there. Um, and I think that Reid Hoffman, sort of the great sort of internet entrepreneur, has this sort of great quote that basically, if you want to have a consumer internet play which works, it has to appeal to one of the deadly sins. And sort of we've been sort of going on about gluttony, and gluttony is the basic tastes, sugar, salt, fat,
Mhm.
sensory specific satiety will do it to you all the time. And on the other hand, you can counter it a bit if you basically, I think craft beer has been incredibly successful, and specialty coffee too. That there's a lot of status, a lot of pride.
Yeah,
You know,
I think
it,
that's, and
and
I think part of it is that. Part of it is you have to tap into you have to make people part of a thing. You get to
yeah,
be part of this club, or what I think is more sustainable and more inclusive is leaning into storytelling, figuring out how to make people invested in the story of what this is, rather than just purely that sensory experience. Then the sensory experience is making you part of that storytelling process. Now that's a lot of hard work, and I think we can probably both speak from experience with the
yeah.
frustration of the success rate of that. But I think ultimately that's how I engage with it. I think most deeply, and I think it's most rewarding when I see people, in return invest in that.
I think that's definitely right. I think the storytelling and the community it's a sort of necessary condition as well, but I don't know if it's the only one. I think one of the things which we forget is that craft beer is generally a social experience.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's much more shared. It's much easier. In the UK, if you go to a pub, it says a lot about you what beer you choose. You are no. It's like which football team do you support, which beer do you choose. It says a lot about
Yeah,
you.
yeah,
Now, most people when they consume chocolate, it's a solitary purchase.
right.
You know, and it's not. I think that. So I think getting the occasion and making it a bit more social and actually that's where you get the virtuous circle going, because how do you make it social? You got to tell the stories about it, and some of those stories about being able to articulate flavor, so you have a language about it and you can explain what it is which gives rise to the flavor, which beer's done brilliantly. I don't think chocolate's there yet. And I think the other bit to it though is that it's the story behind the makers, it's the story behind the
Hmm.
in the case of chocolate, it's actually easier in some ways because we can give the story behind the farmers too, and the wine industry does that a lot though too. So I mean, I think you are absolutely sort of spot on with the storytelling angle to it there. But I think it's also that it has to be social. I mean,
Yeah.
and it
And I,
and one of the advantages of both specialty coffee and craft beer has been they're out of house,
yeah.
whereas most chocolate is consumed in house.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And I would love to hear from you how you think we build in that social component to chocolate, or if that's even possible. Because you're right, uh, the beverages are almost secondary. I mean, a coffee shop is basically selling you a seat to sit at. They're not
Yeah,
selling you coffee.
no,
Uh,
it's a
so
space.
yeah, so how is it possible to do that with chocolate?
Well, I think there's a cheat answer there, which is that's what Canoops is doing. So the sort of the people who are doing the drinking chocolate back in the UK, and in a way, it's a puzzle that nobody's done it before. What's really fascinating, and when I talked a lot to Jens about this, is they don't actually sit in his coffee stores. He's here in his chocolate stores rather. The social aspect there is actually you go with somebody else and you decide socially what you're going to choose. So there's a social angle in the choosing of it. So I think that there's something inside there which is sort of actually sort of getting couples to come together and choose together. I mean, I think part of the social experience is if you go back again to the learning, the educational experiences. When you go to a wine tour in Napa or anywhere in the States, you get families there. You get husband and wives. It's a great place to take a date. If you take a date to a restaurant, you've got to talk to them the whole time. That's quite frightening for lots of people. If you take a date to a movie, you can't talk to them at all. So actually, what's a great opportunity is take them to a wine place where anyhow they're going to, become a little bit happier with the wine or the beer, and you can also talk to them, but there's also other stuff to talk about. So I think
Yeah.
there's something in the education which we're missing. I mean, it is amazing to me that we don't have more educational experiences. And I think it's something which we need to do more of.
Yeah. And I think one thing, and this is a difficult thing because there's no real way around it. I don't think we can neglect how big of a price discrepancy there is between craft chocolate and non-craft, which is not, even though there's a price
Yeah.
discrepancy between craft beer and mass-produced beer, it is nowhere near as dramatic. It is nowhere near as dramatic with coffee. And when you're looking at chocolate, it is a huge leap to get somebody to go from $2 for a chocolate bar to $12 for a chocolate bar.
Yeah, no, it's slightly less in Europe, but I think you are right. But I think that's part of the out of house experience because actually coffee does have it in a strange way, and beer does have it too to an extent, which is that you can buy beer in a UK supermarket for absolutely nothing. And actually, that's now the threat to pubs. The pub is whether it's selling craft beer or whether it's selling,
Mhm.
industrially processed beer. It's the same thing. Um, so, but you are definitely right. The price issues there. I mean, one of the interesting things is going to be not for mass market confectionery, not for your Mars bars, not for your Snickers bars, but certainly for your Lindt bars. One of the interesting things about the price of cocoa going up is that's going to be a challenge for them. You know,
Mhm.
they're only they're going to be. It's difficult to see how they can keep it at $2 or $3. If the price of cocoa stays at $10,000 a ton, and it may go up even further, without some very very clever technology, which is going to be making man-made chocolate, I don't think we're going to see the same price differences that we've got. But it does also come back to the fact that I think it's the format which confuses. So people will pay a lot for chocolate, but it's filled chocolates.
Mm.
It's the
Yeah,
format.
yeah,
It's that
you're right.
you're right. You've got a price expectation. But I mean, if you basically sold people a box of chocolates, they're willing to
Mm,
pay a lot more. So
that's
again, I think it
interesting.
is this issue around the bar. So one of the things that
Mm,
we try and get, and I'll put these in the show notes afterwards, is we've now got a bunch of makers who are making. In the UK, we have a product which is called After Eights, which is basically a box full of little mints in
mm,
wrapped in chocolate, or Bendix have got them there. And this is like a box of Neapolitans, but that
mm,
doesn't have a price expectation to it. So you can easily charge 10 to 20 quid for it.
mm.
And you can actually use two or three chocolates inside it. So you can actually teach people the difference in flavors. So you're actually sort of killing two birds with one stone. And as a third one, it's much more likely that somebody will take that to a dinner party and it will get served than a couple of bars of craft chocolate. So I think the
Sure.
format is a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think you're right. That's
Anyway, so
challenging.
listen, as ever, I've learned a ton, but the thing I really, really want to learn from you is a little bit about how do we do pairings? Because
Yeah,
this
for
is something
sure.
which I mean, so I have to say, I mean, and also a hat tip to one of the great, I mean, actually, who's a great example of this, Andrea, who we both know, who sort of runs the British
Hmm.
Flavor
Yeah.
Society. I mean, you did a fantastic talk with him, which they were all absolutely blown away by, and you did do these amazing pairings with some Belgian beers and some chocolates, and you are the go-to expert on basically how to pair different bars with different chocolates. And you talked about this before, and I'd love to, you pick four very different bars. Most of the time, we have most of those bars in the UK, so we can get those. Although the beers are a little bit trickier for us, but David,
Yeah.
over to you. So run through some of your
Yeah,
your sort of
sure.
classic smart pairings.
Well, Well, what I'll do at the outset here, as you mentioned, I picked a couple pairings in anticipation of this event. I'm going to walk through those very quickly and just give like basic explanations of how they work, with the idea that anybody watching, if you happen to have these beers or similar beers to them and these bars, all of which, when I picked these like a month or so ago, were available on your site. I don't know if they are today or not, but have at least been available from Cocoa Runners. I'm going to walk through these. And then we'll talk about some basic things to keep in mind if you want to try to do your own pairing at home. So the first pairing I picked today is with a hazy pale ale. I believe the example I gave for the UK audience was Deo Rolling Man. It's a hazy pale ale, should be pretty easy to pick up there. Pale ales and IPAs are primarily a showcase for the character of hops. Hops are a small flower that grows on a climbing vine that are the primary seasoning agent in beer, and they can provide two main characteristics to beer. One is bitterness from some organic acids in the hops. The other is a wide range of flavors and aromas from the essential oils in those hops that contain all sorts of different aromatic compounds. There are hundreds of different varieties of hops, and depending on which varieties a brewer uses and how they're used in the brewing process, you can get more or less of that bitterness, more or less flavor and aroma, and a wide range of flavor and aroma. Pale ales and IPAs are really a showcase for the character of those hops, primarily the flavors and aromas that you can get from them, which can be a wide range of fruity flavors and aromas, botanical, floral, herbal, pine-like, all sorts of different flavors and aromas, depending on which ones are selected and how they're used. And this is not a group of beers that typically most people think of pairing with chocolate. People generally default to porters and stouts because those contain roasted malts that have some very easy complementary flavors to chocolate. They get roasted very similar to how cacao beans get roasted. So you get some of those similar heat derived flavors. So chocolate and coffee and burnt caramel and things like that. So it's a very natural pairing. People don't generally think of pale ales and IPAs as working as well with chocolate, but with the right bars, they can be really beautiful. So I picked out two bars just as an example to pair with a hazy pale ale. One of those is Razavallji white chocolate with matcha tea. I apologize to any Hungarians who are hearing my pronunciation of that name, but this is a white chocolate bar made with matcha tea and spiced white chocolate. And I'm using spiced broadly to refer to conventional spices, botanicals, herbs, tea, just kind of any of those types of seasoning agents. Spiced white chocolates can work beautifully with hazy pale ales or lower bitterness hazy IPAs. Those beers have these bright, citrus fruit or stone fruit, tropical fruit flavors. And the like milky creaminess of these white chocolate bars combined with that, along with the spice components, you basically get the equivalent of like a spiced botanical fruit smoothie when you bring these together. The matcha tea here complements those soft fruit characteristics from the hops really, really well. I compare this sort of to being like a sangria with like a sprig of thyme on it, just a really beautiful pairing between those two. Another pairing that we're going to go with is Hogarth's Gianduja bar. This is a hazelnut bar. It still similarly has that creamy base to it that'll work really well with the fruitiness of the hops. In this case, instead of a green botanical, this matcha tea, you're going to be looking at the hazelnuts themselves, providing sort of a little bit of earthy bitterness to complement that fruit character. So you get this earthy and citrusy character between those two. Similar pairings in concept, but with very different specific flavors that are working with both of them. So I love using hazy pale ales or hazy IPAs in a professional pairing setting because people are never expecting this style to work well with chocolate. And when you get it with a bar like one of these two that works really well with it, it can just light people's eyes up because it's so unexpected. The other pairing I went with is actually one of the beers that I used in the pairing you were talking about with Andrea for the British flavorists last month. This is a Flanders Red Ale. I recommended a couple that are very easy to find, Rodenbach Grand Cru or Duchesse de Bouillon. Flanders Red Ale is a sour Belgian ale style that gets aged in oak. So it undergoes a conventional fermentation like most beers. Then it gets put into large oak vessels and it gets inoculated with some additional microorganisms beyond conventional brewing yeast. And those microorganisms will create acidity, so a little bit of tartness, as well as some more complex spice flavors within there as well. These have sometimes been compared to red wine in their flavor profile. You're not going to taste it and confuse it for red wine, but it's in a similar kind of flavor category with some of those wine varieties. This is one of the most flexible pairing styles out there. I really, really love this with a wide range of chocolates. I selected two that I would recommend trying it with from the Coca Runners catalog. One of those is Nog's Old Fashioned. This is a bar that is kind of emulating the flavors of the old fashioned cocktail, but using Irish whiskey. So it's got orange bitters, dark sugar, Irish whiskey in it. And the flavor combination here is the orange citrus flavor of the bar itself, along with some of the red fruit, like cherry-like notes that you can get from this acidic tart beer. Those just complement each other so beautifully. Old fashions here, might have that cherry in it, so you get that nice contrast. And then the dark sugar, this is using burnt sugar in the bar, along with some of the sweet base malt notes in the beer. You get some little bit of oxidation from the time that it spends in wood, and you get these nice dark sugars. Just creates this easy union between the two to allow the other flavors to come together. Really beautiful pairing. And then the last pairing I'll give with the Flanders Red is a single origin pairing. And typically, single origin pairings, I don't encourage people starting out with if you're first doing beer and chocolate pairings because they can be much harder to predict than inclusion pairings. I generally recommend get some inclusion bars. It's going to be easier to start with the very obvious flavor hooks in those to try to pair with something in beer. It's more predictable what's going to be driving those flavors. While single origin bars can pair beautifully, it's much harder to predict what those driving flavors are going to be. Even if you're working with an origin you've had before, the
Yeah,
specific estate it's from, how it was fermented, processed, how the chocolate maker roasted
vintage.
it, how long they blew off the volatiles, you're going to have potentially different flavor profiles. So generally, that's something that requires a little bit more fine tuning. In this case, this is a bar that I've had that works beautifully with this style. This is Stranger out of the UK, their Oco Caribe Dominican Republic bar. I was really excited to see you had this because They are one of my favorite recent makers with these single origin bars. I just love the profile they're getting out of several different origins I've had from them. I've had their Belize and their Madagascar as well. And they're doing a beautiful job. This particular bar has this really nice kind of caramely undertone to it. And the way that it pairs with this beer is fascinating. The caramel and sort of even though this is like 70%, I feel like it it eats a little bit lower percentage than that. I feel like it's got a little bit more perceived sweetness and creaminess to it. Works beautifully with that like dark sugar base that you get in the beer. Then when you bring in the acidity and the fruit notes from the beer, this tastes almost like a strawberry or cranberry vinaigrette together with just a little bit of chocolate mixed into that. It's a beautiful and surprising combination between the two. Very, very indulgent, but also easy to appreciate. Not something that's going to, it's not what we would euphemistically call an acquired taste, maybe. It actually is very, very easy for somebody to taste and immediately enjoy, even though there's a lot of complexity there to appreciate with it. So those are just a handful of examples that you can nibble on if you want to grab those. And then Spencer, if you want to go into talking about some specifics of
Yeah,
the
the
pairing
principles would be great.
processes. Sure.
I just want to
Yeah.
make certain I'm showing
So
the right one. You said stranger, didn't you?
yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's
So
it.
yeah, so
That I think
so
that's new packaging. I think the
that is
packaging
the
I've
new
seen
packaging.
before.
So
Yeah.
and that's our Ukrainian chocolate maker, which we smuggle in.
Mm.
They literally carry it over the front lines to us. So this is Tatiana and Razlan's sort of bar, and it is I think it's absolutely amazing. This is the new packaging. This is one of their
Yeah.
latest origins too, which is this. I'm just going to show it here, which we're just about to get into, which is their. I'll send you some actually after this, David. This is their Trinidad and Tobago, which is absolutely
Oh, I'd
fantastic. I
love to
love you
try
can't
that.
with the beer, but I
Yeah, I'd
think
love to try
I
that.
was really interested though, just to go back to the principles because we do quite a lot of. I mean, when we get you over to the UK, which is the next great aim, is that we're actually going to do this in person with all the beers and everything else because it's just going to
Absolutely.
be so much easier. We do quite a lot of wine and chocolate pairings, and one of the things we
Hmm.
find with wine and chocolate pairings is there's a sort of broad set of assumptions, right? Red wine relatively easy to pair,
Hmm.
white wine phenomenally hard. But the reason why that is that the first principle I think of wine and chocolate pairing at least is get the structure and the mouthfeel right. So don't jar. And then it's exactly what you said, which is get the flavor pairings working. And I think your insight about using actually some inclusions is a very clever one, which is that you know, for example, one thing which we like doing is we love taking orange wines because that is a white wine which does actually work with
Hmm.
chocolate, and it works brilliantly well with something like Pump Street's rye or with something like Hogarth. You mentioned the
Hmm.
Janjuja. They've also got an amazing bar, which I'm just trying to find in my desk in front of me, which I put down somewhere, which I'll find in a minute. But anyway, they have an amazing bar, which is um, which is made with buttered toast, and that is
Mm,
tremendous to go with orange wine. So, but what are
I
the
bet.
principles that you use with beer? Because I've always sort of found that actually the nice thing is that you know actually beer is very flexible. You can do a lot
Hmm.
more pairings with it than you can with wine. So with wine,
Absolutely.
milk chocolate is not easy actually. With maybe with a Rioja you can use a dark milk, but I mean it is it's just not easy because they clash a
Yeah.
lot more. So tell me a little bit about what principles you use for.
Well, yeah, on that note, I mean, one thing that I love about beer, and I love this for its own sake, but also specifically for pairing, is that you have such an unbelievably wide flavor range within beer.
Yeah,
You
that's
could have
very
two
true.
different beer styles that have nothing in common with each other from a flavor standpoint. Whereas in wine, while each individual wine can have a tremendous amount of complexity, you're always dealing with some degree of acidity within those. And like that basic flavor range, I think is a little bit more narrow when you're looking at those pairings. So on the beer side, one of the things I say in the book, and I've said a number of places, there is a beer for every chocolate. There is not necessarily a chocolate for every beer. There are some individual beer styles that I think are tremendously difficult, but because of the
Mm.
variety within beer, you don't really have to worry about them. There's always going to be another style that you can work with. So when you talk about structure in the pairing and mouthfeel, one of the things that I think is most foundational to be able to dial in on beer and chocolate is at the basic taste level, specifically bitterness, because beer has a bittering agent in it. As I mentioned earlier, hops have organic acids, and depending on how they're used in the brewing process, those organic acids can produce a lot or a little bit of bitterness in the beer. That bitterness can pull out some of the harshness in cacao in ways that you aren't necessarily aware are going to be there until you actually taste them together and realize how harsh those can be together. So I always recommend if you're just starting out with, you want to get some bars and some beers and just play around with them with some friends and see what you think. Generally, looking at beers that have a little bit more residual sweetness to them, maybe are a little bit sweeter than the bar that you're pairing with, is going to give you a little bit more of a safety net and a cushion against that bitterness getting too harsh. And staying away from styles that have a lot of aggressive bitterness to them. So American style IPAs, German style Pilsners, American barley wines, beers that just have like an aggressive bitterness for its own sake are generally going to be very difficult sells on the pairing side with chocolate. So getting that basic taste arranged to where you've got a little bit of a soft cushion around those flavors, and then you can work with, do these individual flavors complement each other, is a good place to start from. And then you can kind of fine tune from there if you want to experiment more. So I always recommend people start with beers that have a little bit more residual sweetness to them. Probably the single most flexible style is English style barley wine. So if you look at some of your English barley wines or English old ales, contrary to the name, barley wine is a beer. It just gets called wine because of its strength. They're usually up around 10, 12% alcohol. But you look at something like J.W. Lee's Harvest Ale, um, anything that has old in the title is generally either going to be an old ale or a barley wine. So you've got a few of those over there. Thomas Hardy's ale. They're going to be a little bit more expensive
Decent
because
old
they are
beer.
stronger, but they are going to pair beautifully and flexibly with a lot of bars because they have a good amount of residual malt sweetness underneath them that can kind of ease you into those individual flavor pairings. They're going to be more indulgent. Um, Sometimes that sweetness can obscure a little bit of complexity, but they're a great starting place to be able to dial in flavors from there, and then you can try some other styles. Uh, I mentioned the inclusions versus single origin. Starting with inclusions is going to provide you a leg up and beginning to bring those flavors together. One thing that I think is really nice on the beer side, because of the small sample sizes you're going to be using of just, a bite of chocolate and a sip of beer, you don't have to worry quite as much about the concern of intensity being terribly different. If you're pairing a beer with a meal, if one side of that is aggressively more intense in terms of the overall flavor amplitude and basic taste amplitude, it's going to bowl over the other side of the pairing, and you're not going to be able to appreciate the combination of flavors. You're working at such small flavor samples when you're pairing beer and chocolate that the difference in intensity really doesn't get projected out very far. And so you can try what would be a pretty intense beer with a relatively subtle chocolate. And if you just adjust how much of that beer you're taking into the sip versus how much chocolate you're having, you can really balance that out pretty easily in terms of allowing more chocolate to melt and having a smaller amount of beer and match those
That's really
intensities
interesting.
a little easier that way. Um, Along with that, canceling of flavors is not a big of a concern with pairing beer and chocolate. When you're pairing meals, again, you generally don't want to pair like ingredients on both sides of the pairing because, so for example, having something like a cherry dessert with a beer that has cherries in it, you might initially think this is going to amplify the perception of cherry. What actually happens is that those end up occupying the same flavor space, and the overall perception of cherry kind of gets sucked in, and you lose some of that intensity, cancels each other out, and it throws off the balance of those flavors. On the chocolate side, again, partially because of the small sample sizes, but more because of the sequence of how you're going to do this pairing, which I'll explain in just a moment. You don't have to worry about that quite as much. And the subtleties in the difference of using the same ingredients on both sides. So a beer that has cherry and a bar that has cherry or berry in it or something is not as much of a concern. They don't really cancel each other out in the same way. And then getting to the biggest thing, which I just alluded to, the sequence of how you pair these together is critically important. You
Mm.
have to taste your chocolate first. You have to allow the chocolate to melt. Beer is, when it's served out of the draft, it's usually under 40 degrees Fahrenheit, just a couple degrees Celsius. And when it's even when it's, if you're going to let it warm a little bit, when you take it out of the fridge, it's still going to be significantly colder than the melting point for that chocolate. So if you take a sip of beer, then put a piece of chocolate in your mouth, that chocolate's just going to sit there. It's not going to melt. You're not going to get any of the aromatics. You're not going to get any of that retronasal olfaction to be actually be able to get flavor perception. And you just had a sip of beer with a piece of chocolate in it. You didn't taste anything of the chocolate. You got to let that chocolate melt on your tongue, really cover the surfaces of your mouth, get that retronasal olfaction to where you're getting that flavor perception, then take a sip of the beer with it. Then you'll get that combination of flavors. And it's almost more of a sequential pairing than it is just let's toss both of these things in our mouth and see what happens. So doing it that way is going to allow that chocolate to fully express before you bring in this colder liquid that would otherwise lock it up.
That's very interesting. That's a really interesting insight because when we do, it's very interesting because most of the other pairings we do, we actually say, don't worry too much about the order. But there's a reason for that, which is that because we're mainly pairing red wine, it's at room
Mhm.
temperature. And again,
Right,
with coffee and with tea, we're also pairing drinks which are hot. And you're right,
right,
because basically, the secret to the flavor wave is that the initial flavors are all released by heat. And so if your mouth is cold, it doesn't work. And interestingly, when we do the orange wine, we actually serve it at room temperature for that reason, because
sure.
otherwise it does jam and jar. I mean, I think I'd like to go back to one thing though, which sounds a bit nerdy, but actually I think it's for all of you who are enthusiasts about beer and chocolate pairings. I do think that beer is just amazing, and I think that you gave a hint to it when you talked about the thing to look out for is bitterness, because that's your problem. Whereas actually, when you're pairing most other products with chocolate, whether it be wines or whether it be coffees and everything, actually the real problem is the astringency. It's the
Hmm.
tannins which cause all the problems. Now,
Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm definitely not a beer expert, but there isn't nearly as much tannin in beer
Not
in most
unless,
cases.
generally not unless it's a flaw. You can get astringency, but it's going to come from typically a mistake during the brewing process. So
Right.
depending on how, the first stage of the brewing process, the mash, when you're mixing your grains with your hot water to get saccharification of those starches, depending on how some of those grains are extracted, you can, and your water chemistry, you can extract tannins from the husks of those grains. Also, if you are aggressively hopping your beer, you can extract some astringency from the hops potentially. So those can happen, but they are not intended and they're not pervasive. The only other way that you can sometimes get a little bit of astringency is from oak aged beers. If they're aged on very
Yeah.
young oak or they're aged for a very long time in oak, you can get some oak tannins that will create a little bit of that. But it's still going to be lower in the balance than you're getting from like a full bodied red wine that's going to have a good amount of that.
So this is an
So
unfair and very
typically,
nerdy question.
no,
But
no,
if
no.
you
I mean,
don't, so
typically you're
so
right. It's you're not going to get as much there.
so one of the things that fascinates me is that one of the theories as to why you get this delightful wave with chocolate and the flavors, all the 400, 500 different aromas, all revealing different flavors at different times, is partly because cocoa butter sticks in your saliva and it releases those volatiles at
Mm.
different times. But it's also similar to the way that coffee or red wine or an oat white wine or teas, the tannins give them some of the structure, the backbone, if you like, which releases flavor. So what is it which gives beer? Because beer definitely has an amazing length of flavor.
Mm.
How is, I mean, what's the
Yeah.
technical underpinnings
Yeah,
of
I mean,
that? And
there's a few different things there. I would say if you wanted to do a direct comparison to those tannins, I think it is that bitterness because when we talk about bitterness in beer, when I'm first explaining that to maybe a group of newcomers in a tasting, bitterness is a word that you instantly have a reaction to. And usually it's a negative reaction. It doesn't sound good. Bitterness, though, doesn't always mean in the beer side, it doesn't always mean noticeable above threshold bitterness in the sense of I taste this and immediately identify it as bitter. Even a beer that you taste that has no perceived bitterness to it, if the bittering agents in those hops were not present, it would taste syrupy sweet. It would taste, the flavor balance would be off. Bitterness is playing a role there to keep those other basic tastes in check, even if it is not something that is standing up above the wall and you can actually notice it on its own. So that bitterness is allowing everything else to kind of express itself naturally rather than that sweetness, running away with things. It is providing that structure that you're talking about. I picture it, and I often picture flavors visually. I know not everybody does that, but I often picture it as like a wall, and those other flavors are kind of lining up against that wall, kind of keeping everything in check rather than just them allowing them to just kind of flatten out and fall away from that. Additionally, though, as the beer warms in your mouth, different volatiles are going to release. And this is something that would be true of any food or beverage. As it warms, you're going to have different volatiles that release that you're able to perceive retronasally. And this is something we're still studying, and I'm not going to be able to give a very detailed answer on this, but there are also enzymatic processes, from your saliva
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
interacting with some of those compounds as
The
well.
bonded
So
volatiles. Yeah, the
yeah,
bonded volatiles.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think actually that you hinted at something there, which is that one of the great things about doing a pairing is that it makes you slow down. The
Hmm.
disaster with lots of foods at the moment is, and with lots of confectionery, is that they just want you just to, scoff. And actually, just as you shouldn't glug your wine or, scarf your beer rather, sorry. The great thing about doing a beer tasting is that you should just slow it down because you're right. If you keep it in your mouth, that's the thing which is going to release all the
And
volatiles. And
this
the great
is
thing that chocolate's got.
Yeah, whenever I'm talking with any group, whether it's a beer tasting, a chocolate tasting, a pairing between them, 90 to 95% of the tasting process is universal to every different food and beverage segment, and it just comes down to slowing down and paying attention. There's like 5 or 10% that might be unique processes for each thing that we've learned you got to do this particular thing in a coffee cupping, but like most of it is just slow down and pay attention. And if you slow down and pay attention to your senses, that's most of the secret. And it applies to anything. It applies to wine, beer, chocolate, coffee, spirits, whatever. Slow down, pay attention to your senses. And if you're doing that, then as you do that over time, you'll gain vocabulary and you'll learn to pay attention to different things. But like that's most of it. It's not some special trick. Just slow down and pay attention. And if you do that, that's going to, on its own, change so much of your perception of whatever it is you're tasting.
And I think going back to what you were saying earlier, that this is that's what teaches you, that's what gives you the reward. So that
Hmm.
that it is, once you learn to slow down and savor, that's the first step to moving to, and opening up these senses, which I mean, to me, it's just crazy. We eat and drink 3 or 4 times a day, and it's
Yeah,
the most amazing experience to be able to sort of savor, but you have to teach people how to do it,
yeah,
which I think is what
yeah.
you're fantastically doing on. So, so,
Well,
so,
thank you.
so, the other sort of question that I'd love to sort of ask you, and then I probably should let you go off and have your day in Ohio. So it's a little bit. So where can people find out more? You've obviously got the amazing book, which we're delighted. I think it makes the most amazing present. I'm going to say Christmas because we're coming up to Christmas, but this is going to be a piece of evergreen content. So it's a great present for anybody, not just people who are into beer, but anybody who wants to know about pairing in general and about flavors. What else? You've got a fantastic podcast. What else? How else do you stay fresh? How else do you keep learning? What else do you
Yeah.
enjoy and look at?
Well, honestly, I mean, you just said that about not just for folks who are into beer or into chocolate. One of the things that I want to encourage people to do at all times is to follow your curiosity, to be willing to be curious, even if it's about something that you don't have an initial investment in, even if you don't think you like beer, it doesn't cost you, well, it might cost you a little bit monetarily, but it doesn't cost you anything to just try a thing and engage it with curiosity, even if you don't end up enjoying it. And that's something that I have largely followed intentionally in my career and personally, and I'm fortunate for those to be able to overlap a lot with what I do. But following curiosity. If there's something that sounds interesting, even if it's in an area that I maybe didn't realize I was interested in, do a little bit of reading about it, taste something, and find out if that's something that's going to be a new pursuit or just inform the things you're already into. So with beer, pairing beer and chocolate, even if you think you're not into beer or you think you're not into chocolate or whatever it is, try a pairing, see what you think. If nothing else, it's going to be an enjoyable experience doing it that one time and it's going to satisfy your curiosity. You might find it's something you want to engage in further. So for me, that's how I keep myself sharp is I'm always interested in trying new things. And I'm most of my, for example, most of what I drink is beer. But I've got a friend who runs a great wine bar, and I go there and I try interesting wines. Even though that's not what I do professionally, I find that expands my flavor understanding. It's interesting to learn about a thing that I don't know as much about. So taste widely and follow your curiosity. You're not obligated to make this a whole new area of pursuit. It might be one, but even if it isn't, it's enjoyable to learn for its own sake. It's enjoyable to have those experiences. Outside of just the book, which again you can get on the Cocoa Runners website or on Bean to Barstool if you're here in the U.S. You can check out beantobarstool.com for the podcast and the blog. We are actually looking at trying to expand our coverage a little bit and get some other writers in to look at other areas of beverage alcohol in conjunction with craft chocolate. So we're going to be trying to get into that more in 2025. If you are into craft beer or want to learn some more things about it, you can check out my website, davidnilsenbeer.com. Also, I co-edit a quarterly print beer zine called Final Gravity with my wife, Melinda Guerra, and our emphasis is upon very personal, human-centered stories that typically don't get covered in other like more glossy beer publications. So very personal essays. We have a big focus upon diversity and equity and inclusion. So something like 65% of our articles have been written by women and about 40% have been written by persons of color. So we have a big emphasis on trying to make sure that a wide range of voices are being represented in that. And we've had folks who have read it who are not maybe into beer in a big way, but they're engaging with the stories themselves because these are such interesting personal angles that just kind of happen to connect to beer. So if you're into that, definitely check that out. You can find that on the Bean to Barstool website as well. And beyond that, we're always putting out content on there, always new podcast episodes and blog posts and everything else.
Yeah, no, they are. I mean, I love your podcast. I think it's absolutely fantastic. And
Thank you.
look, I mean, hats off to you because you've done pioneering work, and you basically you've really proven that 2 + 2 = 5 in this case. And I've learned tons from you about beer and chocolate. I've learned
Thank you,
tons
Spencer.
today too. So really can't wait for you to come over in person with your
I
wife to the
know.
UK. We've got
Maybe
to
we'll
get
make
you
that
over.
happen. And
We've got to get
yeah,
you over.
this
And then
next
we're going
year.
to do
Maybe
a
we'll try to find
massive
it.
tasting. Yeah, we
Be
definitely got
awesome.
to find a way to do it. It would
Yeah,
just be amazing.
we'll look at that for 2025. It's time. It's
Yeah, it
time.
definitely is time. Just give us a little bit of time, and I know that we would have like roomfuls of people. But thank you so much. I have learned so much. Just fantastic. Wishing you
Yeah.
all the best.
Thank
And
you, Spencer. This has been a lot of fun.
yeah, I've
I've
learned
enjoyed the
tons.
conversation. Yeah, me as well.
Always, always, always.
I think our conversation spurred some new thoughts I got to follow along. We had some really interesting
Yeah, we
exchanges, I
definitely
think.
do. We should definitely talk more about lots of those different areas. But I think there's an awful lot we can learn from craft beer, and there's an awful lot we can learn from your tastings. So
Well,
fantastic.
thank you, Spencer. Appreciate everything you do.
Thank you very, very much.
Take care.
Thanks. Take care. Keep well. Bye bye.